My presentation up. There we go. Okay, is that on screen? Yes, Peter, thumbs up? Yeah, okay. As Rhoda said, I've prepared about 15 minutes of talk of some comments that I'd like to make. I'm going to go through this presentation pretty quickly, therefore, obviously. I'm sure you may have questions about any one of these slides. Please feel free. I'm happy to discuss any of them in more detail. So I appreciate the chance to discuss with you today an issue that has been bothering me for over 30 years, the growth of economic inequality in America. To me, the COVID crisis has made clear that inequality can have fatal consequences at the same time that social media has allowed us to really see for ourselves how great the gap has become. As shown by this picture on the left of billionaire David Geffen tweeting from self-quarantine on his yacht, next to one of essential workers, most of them low income, lining up to be tested. I first tried to do something about inequality about 20 years ago when I went to Capitol Hill to lobby against the elimination of the estate tax, an issue of particular interest to me, since my father made a lot of money as an entrepreneur, and I myself had a lucrative decade working as an investment banker. So I imagined I could offer a pretty compelling story about why I thought a strong estate tax is not only in the best interest of society, but also of the inheritors of wealth themselves. But the sad truth is I lost that battle and have lost again repeatedly over the last 20 years, during which time I left Wall Street for academia, getting a PhD in psychology at Columbia, where I currently teach in the psychology department. But my real field of expertise is behavioral economics. And in my talk today, I will use that lens to try to explain why, for the last 30 years, the US government has consistently acted to increase inequality, in the hope that at the end of my talk, you will agree with me that the US government should stop. I begin by simply pointing out what should be obvious. The current federal tax code increases inequality because taxes are so much lower on income from investments than on income from working. Here's a highly simplified example. A married couple earning an income of $150,000 from work alone would pay just over $19,000 in federal taxes, while a married couple making the same amount entirely from capital gains would pay just under $7,000. It's a simple mathematical fact that this means the richer couple, the ones with all those investments, can accumulate more wealth faster than the couple who has to work for a living. Incredibly, the COVID crisis has shown that Congress extends this rich positive approach even to economic relief. The 3 bills passed so far give about 6 times as much support to businesses as to individuals, even though the richest 10% of Americans own almost 90% of the stock market. Now, I'll be the first to acknowledge that one big reason Congress likes to help the rich so much is, in the infamous words of bank robber Willie Sutton, that's where the money is, in terms of campaign funds and lucrative post-government careers. Worse, this process has been self-reinforcing. Greater inequality has increased the political influence of billionaires, leading to even greater inequality. But tonight I want to talk about what I think has been an equally effective, though less appreciated way that the rich have exerted political influence: right-wing support of economic research, the one branch of academia not dominated by liberals. And the key thing you need to understand is that in standard economic theory, inequality is good. Inequality is an incentive to work hard, to create, to save and invest. In a few slides, I'll explain why I disagree that inequality is always a good thing. But since there is certainly some truth to this argument, I will first try to explain its logic as simply as I can. At the heart of capitalism is the accumulation of capital, like apple trees. which year after year produce apples that the owner can eat. If a tree produces more apples than the owner wants to eat, the owner can trade some of them to other people who want apples more than the lemons they've grown, which makes them better off as well. In other words, your having planted an apple tree has what are called positive externalities, making all of society apple richer. And to be clear, I don't disagree with that basic idea. I do believe in capitalism. But the next step is where economists start to lose me, though you can judge for yourself. They make what seems to be another reasonable assumption. People are lazy and would rather sit around eating apples than making the effort to plant an apple tree. And that's why economists think inequality is good, because they think the only reason anyone is willing to plant a tree is because they know they will then own the apple tree, which is going to produce all those great apples in the future. Now, here's a leap, but stay with me. The apples the tree provides are just like the interest or dividends we get from an investment. And so economists assume that just like people will only plant a tree that was going to produce apples, they only save money because they will get interest on it. In more technical terms, because people are impatient and want to consume today, they must be incentivized into delaying consumption through positive rates of interest. And since economists also think that more capital is better for everyone, they think it's a particularly bad idea for government to tax not only wealth itself, but even the interest and dividends on wealth, because that simply reduces the total amount of capital. In fact, a very well-known theory in economics called Chamley-Judd argues that the optimal tax rate on capital is 0. It's worth quoting one prominent libertarian economist talking about this theory. Quote, "Under standard, pretty flexible assumptions, it's impossible to tax capitalists, give the money to workers, and raise the total long-run income of workers. Not hard, not inefficient, not socially wasteful, not immoral, impossible." Now, those are pretty strong words, but how reasonable are those standard assumptions? I think in this case, economists, and perhaps some of you as well, have made the mistake of thinking of positive interest rates as being a law of nature, like gravity. But interest rates are a social phenomenon, not a physical one, and a rational person will accept negative interest rates as long as they prefer spending money tomorrow to spending it today. And if enough people feel that way, market interest rates can fall below 0, as indeed is now true across the globe. Long-term real interest rates are negative. Now, I'm sure some of you find this baffling. I mean, imagine what you'd think if you saw the law of gravity repealed. So feel free to ask questions about this later. But for the moment, I simply point out that negative interest rates imply that today, government should be incentivizing consumption over savings, not the other way around. There's a bigger problem, however, and not just the practical one, that there is really very limited evidence showing that raising taxes on investment income has much impact on the level of savings. Because even aside from the lack of evidence, it's definitely worth noting that this idea is not necessarily true even in theory. For example, imagine that President Trump tweeted that the atmosphere was now US government property and people would have to pay for oxygen. Would you breathe less? Of course not. Now think about a higher tax imposed on your current income. Will you work less? Well, that depends. If, like most people, you've gotten used to a certain lifestyle based on your current income, chances are actually pretty good that you will work more so that you can pay the extra tax without affecting your lifestyle. Just like you won't stop breathing oxygen just because it costs more. And since I'm particularly interested in the estate tax, let me offer a second example. Suppose you had two children and you wanted to leave each of them one apple tree after you passed away. The government imposes an estate tax of 50%. So you now need to plant 4 trees to accomplish your goal of leaving 2 trees for your kids. How many trees will you now plant? Think about it. The Chamley-Judd theory predicts that people would now plant 0 or maybe 2 trees. Remember, a tax on savings means less savings. As a psychologist, I'd predict that many, if not most of you, would now plant 4. For the same reason, many people will work harder if taxes go up. Your goal is the important thing, not the marginal cost. In short, I think that the assumptions underlying Chamley-Judd might be standard and they might be flexible, but they're simply not correct. Most important, while I agree that some inequality is good, I think the United States has now reached a point where it is very, very bad, and let me explain why. I begin with purely selfish arguments. That is to say, I think inequality is bad for me even as a rich person. The problem is that I think there's copious evidence that humans do not like large levels of inequality. Now, as one of the winners, I might find that an acceptable price to pay for the benefits inequality brings. But for the fact that there's also good evidence that this unhappiness reduces the levels of trust in societies and increases social conflict. And I don't think that's good for anybody. If you're skeptical about those studies, let me ask you this. If you have a will and you have children, multiple children, are you treating your children equally in your will? Research suggests that about 2/3 of people do, which makes sense given other research showing that equality among family members can reduce conflict in family businesses. In my personal experience, most estate lawyers would tell you that if you are not going to split things equally among your children, you should assume there will be lawsuits when you're doing your estate planning. A second reason I think inequality is bad is tentative evidence that it's bad for economic growth. At the heart of the economist's love of inequality is the notion that investment is good. So the rich are benefiting the poor by accumulating wealth rather than spending it. But even in economic theory, investment only serves ultimately to serve consumption, which means too much of either can create a problem. I mean, do you think we'd all be better off if there was 0 consumption and everybody just worked to get richer in the future? I don't think so. All that said, my concerns about inequality are, of course, not just about its efficiency. Does greater inequality make the economic pie larger or smaller? But also about its equity or fairness. How does that pie get divided? And this, I think, is where the economist's real head fake lies. Supporters of Chamley-Judd like to claim that they're just doing economics without making any sort of moral claims. It's impossible to make workers better off by taxing the rich, for God's sake. But that's only true if the following assumption is as well. Whenever anybody creates wealth for themselves, other people benefit too. It's a free market after all. Needless to say, I don't think it's so clear-cut. And so I offer 2 moral arguments why I think inequality is inherently unfair. First, the American ideal is that with hard work, every citizen can improve their economic situation. Yet recent work by economists has suggested that greater inequality leads to less social mobility, a relationship nicknamed the Great Gatsby Curve. Second, and more important, while I agree that it is sometimes true that other people benefit when people create wealth for themselves, most people would agree that Apple founder Steve Jobs deserved his enormous wealth for the multitude of clever new products he created. I know I love my iPad. I am a lot more skeptical that this is always or even mostly true. Bernie Madoff and the Sackler family of Purdue Pharmaceutical, makers of OxyContin, made a lot of money for themselves. But I think it's pretty clear in retrospect that they were hurting, not helping their customers. And while those might be extreme cases, I personally think that many elements of modern capitalism make me wonder how fair the market economy really is. From the billions in profits flowing to a finance system that has been bailed out twice by the government in just over a decade, to the internet's attention-driven business model. Mark Zuckerberg has certainly spent far more money than the Sacklers figuring out how to get people addicted to his product. Finally, to bring this conversation back to the crisis at hand, I'd offer the following observations. First, it's hurting the poor economically more than the rich, making it even less likely that their kids will ever get ahead. At the same time, it's making the richest rich even richer, with the booming stock market of the last 2 months, up until today, heavily driven by the value of the 5 largest tech companies. Second, I would argue that many Americans, particularly millennials, will become even more skeptical about the fairness of a system which values government subsidies to private corporations over direct support to individuals, even in a crisis. So third, we should not be surprised to see increasing social conflict and distrust going forward. People who feel they have nothing to lose have no particular reason to buy into the social contract on which our society so deeply depends. In short, I think Americans will be better served in the future if government support focuses more on creating demand among the poor than on supporting the businesses of the rich. Turning back to tax policy, here are 3 things I would do if I was in charge. But I'll let you read these for yourselves, and I'm going to stop here so we can move on to discussion and Q&A. Thank you. I hope you found it interesting, and I hope you got a lot of questions to ask about it.
Thank you very much, Eric, for a provocative presentation. My job here is quite easy because you have so much to say, and you've done this spiel before on TV and lectures elsewhere. You have a strong message, and so all I want to do is get the ball rolling, and I really want a lot of people from the audience to chime in with questions as well. But I would like to start out by asking you a little bit more about yourself, how you came to these views, a little bit about your bio. You told us some tidbits here and there, but what got you feeling, what made you join an organization like Patriotic Millionaires and take on this cause?
Right. So as I noted in my brief remarks, I mean, I have a somewhat complicated money story, but the basics are, my father was a very successful entrepreneur who founded an early tech company in New Jersey back in the mid-60s, actually. And by the time I basically got to college age, I realized I had a different life course ahead of me than most other people. In large part because of my father's success in business, I decided that when I graduated college, I wanted to go in an entirely different direction. And I ended up as a U.S. diplomat. I was a Foreign Service officer, and my first job was I was stationed in Bogota, Colombia. And I was 22 years old when I arrived there. It was quite an experience. And the thing that immediately struck me about Colombia, and I should note, I love Colombia. My wife is Colombian. That's not a coincidence. I spent a lot of time there. I've spent a lot of time in there over the last 25 years. But my first experience of it was, here's this country where, of course, as a diplomat, I was hanging out with very wealthy people, and they were quite wealthy indeed. But I looked at them and I thought, you know, that's not a very comfortable lifestyle. At this point, Colombia had the security situation had deteriorated so much that rich people had basically stopped living in individual houses. It was just too dangerous in Bogota. And now they were in these high-rise apartment buildings, and they had to move around the city with armed guards. I also had my own bodyguards all the time. And I was just like, you know, I don't think this is good for society. And, you know, the combination of that with the fact that my own life experiences convinced me that, again, it's back to the fairness issue. You know, do people deserve their wealth? Not always. I mean, you know, it's the nature of our society. And again, it's back to, you know, we're all in this together. And so it all just came together. And as I said, the very first issue I got involved in with the estate tax, because to me, that's a no-brainer. I have had the experience of both inheriting money and making my own money. And it's no contest. To me, I value the money I've made so much more. And I say, my aphorism is, Paul Ryan, the former Republican Speaker of the House, once said that it wasn't that Republicans didn't want to help poor people, but they were concerned that welfare created a hammock of dependency. It just made it too easy to not go out and do the things that we need to make a living, contribute to society, et cetera. And my response was, Paul, I agree with you so much, but why aren't you worried about rich kids too? Because if you want a hammock of dependency, just take a look at somebody who inherits a lot of money. And if you agree with me, that's not a good thing for them, then it's a no-brainer to say that's something we ought to be taxing pretty heavily.
We have a question from the audience, and it goes back to the topic of consumption versus investment. And the question is, do you see a trend in millennials to consume less?
Not exactly my area of expertise. I know there's a lot of discussion. Let me take a step back. One of the other important elements that lies behind this theory is exactly that distinction between consumption and investment. And one of the things that I like to point out is I don't think this distinction is as clear-cut as most people seem to think it is. When you buy a house, is that simply something you're consuming? Are you consuming living there? Or is that an investment in the future? It's both. And there are lots and lots of other examples like that. So one point I make is I don't think this is as clear-cut a distinction as most people seem to think. And then secondly, let me put it this way. One thing that has struck me, and a lot of people, I am an investor, and I think a lot about what's going on in the stock market. One people that I think is worrying a lot of investors in the market is the possibility that the COVID crisis itself is going to fundamentally restructure consumption patterns. So I guess my general answer to your question is people believe that there's more stability across time in these things than there really is. So it wouldn't surprise me at all as we move from a generation to generation. I was having a conversation, my parents, a little bit older than my parents' generation, people who really experienced the Great Depression. That was a scarring event. I mean, that totally changed people's attitudes towards savings and consumption for the rest of their lives. And not only for the rest of their lives, there's plenty of evidence that they passed on those attitudes to their children, right? I mean, it's just such a searing experience. Is it possible the experience of millennials who, let's be clear, have now had to deal with two incredible economic crises in a pretty short period of their young lives? Yeah, I think this might change things.
Another question here. If you raise taxes on the rich, what would you do about flight of capital to other countries, or even the competition for rich citizens by different states?
Right. So one thing that I studied is, discussions about differences between Europe and the United States. And I think there is a compelling argument to be made that this is a much bigger problem in Europe than in the United States. For one thing, in Europe, of course, because there are multiple countries that you can access with a single passport, it's very easy to move from country to country. It's very comfortable to move from country to country. I've lived overseas, and I love the United States, and I don't think it's as big a problem as people seem to think. I will also note more critically, the United States has universal taxation, so as long as you're a U.S. citizen, you're subject to the U.S. tax code, which is actually a little different from many other countries. So let me put it this way. I'm a resident of New Jersey, as I assume many of you guys are as well. I've been involved in discussions in New Jersey. If you're a New Jersey resident, you may be aware, we did in fact do away with our estate tax in New Jersey under the Christie administration. I've been involved in conversations with Governor Murphy about reinstating it. I do think there are bigger questions around that issue when we're talking about states. Again, it's pretty easy to move from one state to another. They speak the same language. They're basically the same people. Not that hard. The idea that huge numbers of people are going to renounce American citizenship and move overseas simply to avoid American taxes strikes me as unrealistic. Will it happen in some cases? Yes. I don't think it's going to be very common.
Okay, great. That last question, by the way, came from Catherine Scott. And now I have a question from Joe Sippy Gora. And the question is, thank you for explaining more in 15 minutes than most in 60. My question, since we've been a capitalist society since our nation's founding, is there a decade or more that you believe represents the most equitable treatment by our government, and could it be used as a template now?
Well, you know, history's a foreign country, as the saying goes. It's a tricky question, right? I mean, I would not be the first one to observe that the Donald Trump slogan of "Make America Great Again," the idea being we need to go back to the 50s, means something very different to racial minorities than it does to white people. So I'm very hesitant to make some kind of general claim about a moment in American time that really worked for all American citizens. I'm not clear there is one. I will say this, though, however. We have returned to the levels of inequality that have not been seen since the 1920s. And one thing that is quite clear is that time period following the Great Depression, World War II, that period of the late 40s into the 50s, was clearly a time period of unbelievable economic growth, unbelievable economic opportunity, and extraordinarily high marginal tax rates, right? Now, we can talk about how they applied and everything, but if you wanted to say, again, and look, I don't think we should go back to tax rates of 70 or 90%. No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying we have this experience where we did have tax rates that high, and it didn't seem to really be that bad a thing. Why not give it a try again?
So actually, you cut your presentation short before getting into what your prescription actually is. Could you just run through it a little bit, your three-point plan?
Yeah, let me just throw this back on the screen then. That's what I want. Okay, so basically, again, what I just say right here is, you know, my 3 principles and then 3 conclusions. Going back to my slide, basically saying, look, again, I have had the experience for 30 years, every time Congress has gone in to muck with the tax code, I've come out ahead. It's been absolutely astonishing to me. And the basic reason is because every time they go in, they just keep lowering the rates on investment income. You know, the latest one that I benefit is this big deduction you get if you have a privately held business. And the large part of what drove this, the reason I wanted to give this presentation is thinking about the logic that explains why we do this and realizing how faulty that logic fundamentally is. So number 1 is, look, if you agree with me that inequality is not a good thing, that government is making worse, can government stop making it worse? Let's equalize the rate of tax rates on investment and labor income. Number 2, I mean, again, to compare, I'm not complaining about my situation. I'm quite comfortable. But to compare me to Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos is like, I mean, it's like comparing my wealth to a bum on the street. It's just a total different thing. And again, I think we have lost sight of the fact that, again, I want lots of millionaires in America. I got no problem with millionaires, and I don't have a problem with billionaires either. It's like, I don't think that's a policy failure. But I do think that if you're making billions of dollars, you are really benefiting from our system. And it's entirely appropriate for you to be contributing a heck of a lot more than you are today. And then the final point where I entered all this is, again, it's to me a very simple idea. Our group is called Patriotic Millionaires. Now, a lot of us aren't happy about this. It's a little awkward term, but it's a pretty good term because I like to think that's what I am. I really like this country. I was joking with someone the other day. You know, my family hasn't lived the American dream. My family has lived the American fantasy. I mean, it's just incredible what this country has delivered to us. And I feel it's incumbent upon people in that situation to recognize that and say, you know what, we got to give this chance to other people. And going back to my comment about, you know, when rich people give money to their kids, it's just like private welfare, no different than public welfare. I say, hey, If you want to give private welfare to your own children, have at it. But at the same time, you're going to also have to contribute to the welfare of everybody else's kids as well. Those are my ideas.
I'm jumping around a little bit on the questions. I'm going to try to get everybody's questions answered, but just for now, I'm going to jump to one by Murray Sabrin, coming from a libertarian perspective. The primary proponents, this is Murray, not me, the primary proponents of the estate tax, the income tax, more than 100 years ago were the wealthy who did not want upstart entrepreneurs to accumulate wealth and challenge them in the marketplace and pass their wealth on to their heirs. Both taxes in the final analysis punish success. In addition, the great driver of inequality is the Federal Reserve's easy money policies, which Stanley Druckenmiller stated on CNBC several years ago. Why are you ignoring this in your presentation?
Okay, so let me see. So welcome, Murray. Let me see if I can get all these in. So let me start with the first. I'm not sure I agree with this idea that the proponents of the estate tax originally were, you know, the former aristocracy that didn't want the new wealth to somehow compete with them. I mean, I will point to the most classic discussion of this issue ever, which is by Andrew Carnegie, the richest self-made man in America at the time, called Wealth. I mean, what's more commonly called The Gospel of Wealth is what it's called. And he beats no bones about it. He absolutely comes down on my side of the issue. He says, look, the evidence is clear. It's a terrible idea to give large amounts of money to your children. It's going to destroy them. Why are you doing this? And his point was actually, he was in favor of an estate tax, but we really argued for it. And again, I got no problem with it, because let me be clear. You do not pay an estate tax if you give all your money away. And that's what he wanted to do. And he tried very hard to do it. So the idea that, I mean, and I say he is the guy most close, as far as I'm aware, he is the first rich person to ever say, yeah, we really should have estate taxes. He was as self-made as they come. So that's point number one. Point number two,
it's the issue of the Federal Reserve easy money policies and whether those are the drivers of it.
Okay, so here's the obvious problem with this argument. If the reason interest rates are so low is easy money by the Federal Reserve, why is it an international phenomenon? In fact, negative interest rates are even more negative in European countries than they are in the United States. So it can't, I mean, he could, I suppose, argue that it's all central banks that are doing this. But again, I go back to let's think about the implications. I mean, suppose this were true, right? I mean, I ask a simple question, which is, okay, so you think that this is because there's some kind of manipulation. And the question is, what's your theory about, is this manipulation going to work or not? If the manipulation is going to work, you should spend more now. And that's my question is, why don't you take this as signal to spend all your money now? I, as a rich people, not going to get any returns on my money. I might as well spend it all now. We're back to the circularity of their belief system. The belief system is you have to get a positive return. Again, it is a theory of gravity, and I've seen no explanation for why it should be so.
As long as we're on some of the skeptical questions, here's one from Kenneth Katz. He says, what business is it of the government or you or anybody else to tell me how much I should have? I thought that the purpose of taxation was to raise revenue for various government services, not to engineer desired social outcomes.
Well, I'm not quite sure what the distinction is between delivering services and trying to engineer a social outcome. But the response I always have for people who feel like government should keep their hands off my money is there are places you can go. And the one I always point to is Somalia. I don't think there's really any concern about paying taxes in Somalia. And so if you think that that's a better system, then I say go to Somalia. The simple answer for why it's your obligation is because we live in society together. I mean, I get this all the time. I go on Fox News a lot. And I know every time I'm going to go on Fox News, and I'm going to get the exact same question. If you want there to be higher taxes, why don't you just pay them yourself? Why don't you just send a check to the government? You're a hypocrite. And my point is, I don't just want to pay higher taxes myself. I want all rich people to pay higher taxes together. Because why should you be able to free ride off of me? I'm paying the salary of those military guys who are protecting us in Afghanistan right now. You telling me you don't want to pay their salary? Well, I say, if that's the case, you're not a patriot. So again, the notion that somehow, government, that this money belongs to me, I will simply point one thing out. If you actually look at your money, it's property of the Federal Reserve. It's not yours.
Here's a question from Pepito Soto. Says, do you think that there are many structures / systems in our country that are broken? Education, tax, health, economic, political. Is it time for a restructuring of our society? Where to begin?
Well, that's look, and going back to Murray for a second, I mean, in many ways, I think we would be, in many ways, I do see myself as pretty libertarian. I'm a strong believer that at the start is, everybody if you can't take care of yourself, how good are you going to take care of anybody else, right? So, having said that, and in response to this question, it is awfully hard to argue today that there aren't some serious problems in our society. And I totally agree. I mean, it's hard to know where to begin. But as someone who is kind of libertarian leaning, I would start with the proposition I basically argue for here, which is, can government at least stop making the problem worse? Racism is a terrible problem in our society. There are all kinds of manifestations of it that are deeply problematic. But couldn't we at least begin by agreeing that policemen shouldn't be killing innocent Black people? That to me is that's not like some giant step that we have to imagine. It's like, can we just have government stop killing citizens? So that would be my response is, there's a lot of stuff we need to do. I'd like to start with the lower hanging fruit, and I'd like to believe that's what this stuff is.
All right, I'm jumping around in the questions here. One came in from Donald Marks. He asks, how do your proposals about wealth distribution conform to those of Thomas Piketty?
Well, so originally Rhoda and I had discussed focusing, and we first had a conversation, I think, even before the COVID crisis. And at the time, many people will recall, during the Democratic presidential campaign, there was a lot of discussion about wealth taxes. And wealth taxes are definitely associated with Piketty. He is absolutely a proponent of them. I am sympathetic to the idea. I am not a big fan. I do fall more on the Larry Summers side of this equation, which is, I say, we've got a pretty good wealth tax already. It's called the estate tax. The basic problem with things like the wealth tax is it's just a very complicated animal. There's a lot of mechanisms for avoidance, and it's just more trouble than it's worth. So again, I am sympathetic to the Piketty argument. I'm not fully convinced, by the way, by his argument, but there are a number of things about his argument I find a little puzzling. But again, I think it's one, and again, I encourage, I'm a big, don't get me wrong, I began by saying, Republican or conservative support economic research. I think research is great. I just think that in economics in particular, it's not as unbiased as these people would like to claim. And so basically back to Piketty. I love what he's doing, don't entirely agree, and in particular, don't agree with the main argument he's making about wealth taxes.
I'd like to get the audience, while we still have some time here, to write in about one of Eric's main points in his presentation, which is the topic of why we have positive interest rates. And the theory is that we need to bribe people to postpone consumption because they'll get a return by postponing in the terms of investing their capital
Yeah.
getting more apples
Yeah.
and new apple trees.
Yeah.
So that presumes a discount rate, right? And but the discount rate could be negative. It could be that people actually would rather consume in the future than in the present. So
Yeah.
we had one question that came in already along those lines, and I'd just be interested if people can express in the comment section about that. But while we're kind of waiting on that, there are other questions to ask. I'd like to ask Eric a little bit. In your own life, would you say you have a positive or a negative discount rate when it comes to consumption?
I save more than I spend. I'm not much of a consumer. I give away at least as much money as I spend on myself. But and again, I'm not making any moral claims about it. I acknowledge I'm very happy. I'm happy that I'm just not that interested in material things. I like the life of the mind, and that's not a very expensive life to live at the end of the day. But coming back to time preferences, which is a very interesting topic, because I have taught behavioral economics for many years, and I love that topic because, again, it's like, it's one of these things where people make this assumption, oh, of course people value today more than they do tomorrow. But when you start thinking about it, it's not at all obvious why they should. In fact, one of the main arguments in economics for why people are rational to do that is because we're going to be richer tomorrow, right? Marginal benefit of wealth is higher when you're poorer than when you're richer. Like $100 extra for a poor person is like meaningful, but $100 extra to me, I wouldn't even notice it, right? So the idea is we need more in the future because we know we're going to be richer in the future. And I simply ask, how do we know this? How do we know that we're going to be richer in the future? And the answer is, well, because we always have been. But that doesn't mean we always will be. And again, we're back to where we are right now. I mean, if you're sitting, let's just imagine, here's a very simple question, right? So you're unemployed and you get $1,000 check from the government. Do you spend it today? I don't know that that's necessarily the smartest thing to do. If you're worried about getting food on the table over the next 6 months, you've got to dole it out over time. It's more valuable in the future when you may be poorer and in more need. So, the closer you look at this subject, the more complicated it gets. And there are many economists, I mean, not more modern, but sort of back in the 19th century, who basically said, this is a mistake. People are just making a mistake. It's they're myopic and they lack self-control. That's the only reason. So this would be far longer conversation than we're going to manage here. And again, I just want to say, those of you who think that this is a law of nature, like a law of gravity, are just plain wrong. It is the wrong model to have. It's a supply and demand curve, and those supply and demand curves are determined by our preferences. It's a social phenomenon.
So you sort of answered these two, but I'm going to bring them up anyway, since they're touching on this exact subject. I'll put two questions together. One is from David Weisberg, who says, I wonder if there is an inflection point for saving and investing versus consuming behaviors relative. When you have much more money than you need, people behave in one way, and when you have just what you need, behave in another. And when you have so little, you are making choices between things you need, behave differently again. And Catherine Scott says, what about people who don't have a choice about their spending? Some people have to spend what little money they have to live. They don't have the luxury of surplus to save.
Yeah. Well, let me take the second one first, and then I'll go back to the first one. So, Adam Smith had an interesting comment about this. Adam Smith said, he was even talking about this idea of subsistence, that, you just need to spend a certain amount of money just to survive. And he said, I don't know, because, and I think the example he gave was a linen shirt. He said, strictly speaking, a worker of that time period doesn't need a linen shirt. But the fact that socially it is considered necessary makes it an essential. So now to bring it back to this first question, It is a very interesting question. Again, how people decide, and this is really what I'm interested in, how we ourselves make these decisions, consumption versus saving, these complicated long-term choices that really we have not a lot of experience with, and we're somehow making some estimates in the future. It's fascinating how we do it at all, really. Um, this is, we're back to, and I should emphasize, I mean, I teach behavioral economics, but I don't claim to be an economist. I'm not an economist. I'm a psychologist, and it gets pretty complicated, the question of what Keynes called the marginal propensity to consume. I just want to mention, however, that once again, in economics, there's kind of this standard theory that's taken over the world. But if you go back in the history, there are these interesting little side paths that weren't pursued. And one of them I find fascinating. There was a professor at Harvard named Duesenberry, I forget his first name, Frank, I think. And he came up with this theory of consumption that is basically what I think this person is sort of has in mind, which is, he says, how do people really decide how much to consume? Really, how do they do it? And he said, well, what they really do is whatever they're consuming now, that's fixed, right? And they will resist lowering that very strongly. How do they decide how to spend more? And he said they do it by social comparison. They look at the group that they think they're like and say, I'm going to act that way. And so again, it has a lot of interesting implications for economics as a whole, if in fact humans are not utilizing, and now I'm going to get into weird technical details, our own sort of individual preference curves, but determine our own preferences by looking at the preferences of other people. Economists have been long resistant to this because the math gets quickly very intractable when you have that kind of circularity. But as a psychologist, I say, man, if humans are nothing else, we are a deeply imitative species.
There are sort of two theories for what people do when they get a pay raise. One is that they are more likely to work hard because they value, because they're being rewarded for work, so they'll do more of what they get a greater reward for. The other is the one kind of you went with, which is sort of the opposite theory. Like if you give people a tax increase, they'll work harder to preserve their spending. So Kenneth Katz sort of falls into the latter camp. I mean the former camp, which says that you work harder if you can keep more of your money. I am a highly skilled engineer in my 50s. Why should I work extra years doing socially useful things if the fruits of that labor are just taken away by higher taxes? How does society benefit if I chose to retire early?
Well, I mean, let me. I mean, there are multiple questions embedded that. Let me try and answer the first question, which is, why would I do this? My answer is, you do it because you like it. I mean, neither you nor I are getting paid for this particular event, or at least I'm not. I assume you're not either. Why are we doing it? Because we like doing things like this, and we feel we have a message to convey. And again, I'm back to, I think money is highly overrated as an incentive for humans. And I think this is, again, one of the core problems with economics is they assume that it's the only incentive for humans. And not only do I think, that is clearly wrong, it's definitely not the only incentive. I don't even think it's really the most important incentive. Not to say that it's not important, but I think it's overrated. So why do people do the things they do? They do them mostly because they like them. They feel that it gives them social prestige. I mean, there's a lot of things besides money that we work for. The flip side of that question is, I have something to offer, but I'm not going to offer it unless I'm getting something in exchange. And I'm like, well, okay. Sometimes society has to forego things because we can't afford them or we don't think of. I mean, I will say this again. I've pretty well read in the economics literature and literature around it. And there's this famous thing about Ayn Rand, the libertarian icon. And it's about John Galt, who is this guy in this novel who, for exactly this reason says, I'm not getting the good out of it. And he just disappears. And I always say to anybody who, like Greg Mankiw is an economist at Harvard, a conservative economist, and makes exactly this point. Why should I work harder? My response is, Greg, you know what? Lots of other people would like to do your job. Go retire. Enjoy your time. I imagine we can make do without you. And again, I personally, the notion that any of us is that essential to society is, I think, probably a little overplayed. And let me be clear, I'm not trying to insult, please, I'm not trying to insult any of you out there. I'm just saying, this is how I feel about these things. This is how I look at the world, so.
Okay, so here's a question from Mark Hett, and he's talking not about raising taxes, but what you do with the money that you raise. Isn't it just as, or more important, what we spend on rather than just how much we spend? In other words, spending on sustainable infrastructure, et cetera, is important for a sustainable, viable economy. Spending in and of itself can destroy an economy if it's not sustainable.
Absolutely. And again, when I say it's not always easy to distinguish between consumption and investment, that's not the same as saying that it's a meaningless distinction, because one of the problems is government has a strong tendency to lean towards consumption. Let's just have it today, right? Talk about lack of self-control. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. So, so government. So yes, of course it matters what government does with the money. Although, I will say, I'm actually of the opinion that, yeah, I mean, some economists go, do you really think it would be good to take money from Jeff Bezos and just burn it? And I'm like, yeah, actually, I do think that. I mean, we can chat, we can talk about it, but I think that's true. Having said that, it's not my area of expertise, though I will simply say this. I have not encountered a single economist, investor, really anybody that I can think of that hasn't agreed that America has a huge infrastructure deficit, public infrastructure deficit. Our airports are really crappy, trains are crappy, roads are crappy. There's a vast amount of money we could be spending to really improve our society as a whole. So the notion that, I think at the heart of this is, if we do these taxes, government's just gonna waste it. You know, my response to this is, look, I worked in government. I was a government official for only 3 years, but it was an experience. Yes, government's incredibly wasteful. It's very inefficient. It does a lot of dumb things. But I've also worked in private industry for a long time. And guess what? I've seen private industry be very inefficient, be very wasteful, do really dumb things. So again, I'm like, you know, I waste some money on myself. I give some money, they waste some money. And you know, I don't worry too much about it. I'm not trying to, I think the problem, the emphasis on efficiency, using it effectively, has allowed us to lose sight of the fundamental points I'm making. We're all in this together. The rich are getting an awfully good deal out of this country, no matter how you slice it. And we're all going to be better off if we all pitch in to make it a better place together.
Great. Eric, this is a question for me. Tell us a little bit more about the Patriotic Millionaires. Who's in the group? Do you have specific platforms, for example, specific tax rate? Is it more just conceptual?
Right. And I did notice there was a question in here about membership, and do we have the people of color as members? So let me talk a little bit about it. So I would call us a pretty informal group. I often joke it's like you know, it's like managing academics. You know, I mean, we academics are famous for their large egos, and guess what? Rich people are too. So I wouldn't call us, you know, we're not kind of an organized lobbying group. We basically have agreed on 3 basic propositions. Inequality, the inequality in America and the inequalities of power it's created are a huge problem. Working people, the idea of a working age, if you are a full-time worker in America, you ought to be able to support your family on what you earn. And then finally, the thing that I'm particularly interested in, which is at the end of the year, whatever it is it's going to cost to fund the government, rich people need to pay their fair share, and they have not been doing so. Those are the three principles we agree on. And beyond that, you know, we get out there, we talk, you know, some of us have higher or lesser public profiles, but we're really not a, you know, well organized, and we don't consider ourselves partisan, although we have started endorsing candidates more recently. And in response to the question about our membership, I don't know what the latest numbers are. I think formally we're a few hundred, you know, sort of enrolled members. There are probably only a few dozen of us who are very active. And sadly, and it is a measure of the degree of the wealth inequality in this country, we do have some members who I would say are of color. Not enough of them. But if you're out there, we'd love to have you join. And you don't really need to be a millionaire either. I mean, we're pretty open about, you know, including people who buy into those three principles. So we do have a website, patrioticmillionaires.org. If you're interested, go ahead and take a look. Happy to talk to anyone further about it.
Eric, we're coming to the end now. Just a few more questions. I'm going to combine two, which were similar in theme. One is from Judith Faulkner, who says, this whole discussion is so out of touch with reality. Huge numbers of people who do not have a living wage. Consumption isn't an issue for people who are just trying to make ends meet. They are just trying to make it to the end of the month. And then give me a second while I look up the related question, which was about universal here. Anonymous attendee said, can you speak to the idea of a guaranteed universal income in regards to potentially a future that economists suggests there may be fewer and fewer jobs for people due to high-tech innovations?
Yeah.
Andrew Yang ran on this platform. I'm curious what you think the viability of this would be. So maybe you can put those two together.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great linkage because, you know, are we out of touch? I mean, of course I'm out of touch. That is kind of my point here. I mean, you know, I was joking with somebody. I mean, I live in, you know, suburban New Jersey, and I mean, I watch television and I'm obviously politically engaged, but have I actually directly experienced any of the turmoil and chaos that's going on right now? Not much of it. So I am very sympathetic to this perspective, even if I can't be fully empathetic to this perspective. So as for your second question, because I have, and I do, I think I'm more effective arguing for a policy that clearly is directed against myself. I'm saying I don't pay enough in taxes, other rich people aren't paying enough in taxes, we should pay more. And it's a very simple message. I do favor a universal income. I really do. And it's precisely because, you know, again, I have a lot of questions about what the economy is turning into, where we're heading. And again, this would take us far afield in terms of, I mean, I'm reading a book, you know, I'm very interested in where ideas of fairness come from. How do we know or think what's fair? And I do think that the form of support to citizens that we use today, basically welfare, is problematic for a number of perspectives. And that it would probably be better if we simply reestablished our social contract, the American social contract, to say, you know, and again, I think COVID offers the opportunity, as many people have said, you know, hey, Andrew Yang, he was a guy ahead of his time, because that's exactly what we did. We just sent checks to everybody. And why did we do it? Because guess what? We're all in this together. And everybody's got to stay home, which means you can't earn a living because you can't infect other people. You know, to me, that's an excellent model for why a universal basic income. We're all in this together. We're going to be entering a new world where it's going to be hard for a lot of people to just put basic food on the table. I don't think it's good for anybody, but that they are, you know, the notion that we need to force people to go to work, I also think is deeply problematic. And so I think a universal basic income where we basically say, this is what it means to be a citizen. And let me be clear, when I say a UBI, I get it too. Everybody.
Yeah.
Everybody gets it.
Right.
Because you are an American citizen. That
Right.
is how we reestablish a form of community. That's how we reestablish the idea that we're all in this together.
I'm going to read 3 things that are actually not questions, but just to give you a flavor of what the audience is saying, because they're interesting. Margaret Durbeck said, "I fear for the future." Donald Marks agreed with the point you made about Greg Mankiw at Harvard not being indispensable by saying, yes, the cemeteries are filled with the bodies of indispensable men. And Tom Rees said, I agree with Eric. This is about the point about how we have lousy public infrastructure. I agree with Eric. I live in Germany with high taxes, but using his example, most of our roads are good, and I feel we see and feel what our taxes do. So those are all, I think you have been a hit with this audience. Here's one thing. I'm going to go back to Murray, give Murray another word here. Yeah. Murray Sabrin. He just said, you should read The Law by Bastiat at bastiat.org. This month is the 150th anniversary of the classic pamphlet. And Eric, I'm guessing you're probably familiar with it.
No, I don't. I know Bastiat, but I do not know that pamphlet. And thank you, Murray, because I will be happy to take a look at it. So I always appreciate that. I am a curious person.
Yeah. We are pretty much down to the end of the questions. I didn't ask every single one, but I think I got the bulk of what people had to say. So I believe at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Rhoda unless she wants to push it back to me to extend a little bit. Rhoda, it's over to you. Eric, you and I should be vamping while we wait for Rhoda to come back on.
Oh, I'm also, you know, the problem is there's so much going on here, and I hope I can. In fact, I am. Can I get all this Q&A so I can look through it afterwards and make sure I'm not missing anything interesting here? Yeah, I really appreciate all of you who are contributing. I'm sorry that I can't really follow everything in real time.
Maybe Rhoda went to feed her cats. I'm going to vamp a little bit while we wait for Rhoda to come back. This is another point from Murray. Murray, thank you very much for your contributions. He says, money plus psychic income equal total income. Each individual determines his total income from his actions. All we observe is people's actions. If we do things for free, then our psychic income has driven our actions. Okay, Rhoda, let me just finish this one. Yeah. Thus, not all actions are money-driven, as your presentation tonight proves. I'm sure you probably agree with that.
I do not disagree with that. And again, since I know Murray is an economist, we could go off on a tangent, you know, talking about revealed preference and a lot of interesting debates in economics, but I think that would overwhelm the audience.
Okay, Rhoda, over to you.
Okay, thank you both. I think this was a very, very dynamic discussion. I know I learned a lot, and I have a feeling our audience was very happy that they learned a lot too. And we had so many good questions, and if there are any that remained unanswered, we will definitely provide an answer for you. We'll talk to Eric and see about getting you the kind of response you need. But so thank you very much. And for those of you new to NFRPP, please check out our website. We've got videos of all our past programs on all sorts of topics with interesting speakers such as we had tonight. So thank you, Eric. It was really a special evening. And thank you, Peter, for doing your great moderating job as usual. So good night, everybody, and for the day, wherever you are in the time zone. And thank you again for joining us. So
I yield the floor.